Anti-Semitism is one of those subjects that you can talk about without end, and is also a subject which can really be summed up quite simply. At its heart is, of course, the hatred of Jewish people, the persecution of Jewish people. Right? Those are what we might think is the very essence of what anti-Semitism is. The question is, where does anti-Semitism come from? What does it look like? And obviously, what we might think of as the most important question is, how do we fight it? How do we combat anti-Semitism? It's often referred to as the oldest hate, and it's something that, as Jews, we know doesn't go away. It's something that we are experiencing, sadly, with greater power in recent years. But for those of us who've paid attention, know that it's never gone away. It's always been present, and yet it, shall we say, rears its ugly head from time to time, and there's kind of this ebb and flow that follows anti-Semitism across the centuries. Usually when it gets so bad, there's kind of this reeling back of it, and then it kind of slowly comes forward again. And you kind of see about every 75 years in history, there's kind of this flow. The question always is how bad does it get before that kind of reaction happens? Sadly, there's usually some kind of significant event, obviously the most recent being the Holocaust, but at other times it was expulsions or other kinds of persecutions, and usually kind of after that happens, there's a bit of shock value, and people see what the repercussions are of that hate, and then things can begin to kind of roll their way back. And so, of course, a lot has been written on the subject of anti-Semitism, and understandably, probably because of the Holocaust, which affected all Jews, not only Ashkenazi Jews, but of course Ashkenazi Jews, in terms of numbers, were affected the most, and obviously with the destruction of Jewry in places like Poland and Lithuania and Hungary and Germany, and of course all the other countries around those countries. Understandably, there's been kind of a focus on the Ashkenazi European kind of experience with anti-Semitism. The late Chief Rabbi, Lord Jonathan Sacks, said that anti-Semitism is a virus. It's something that evolves over time. It's something that, the word he used was mutates. And what he said is that it's essentially the same hate throughout the millennia, and yet it takes on a different form. It wears different clothing. It has a different topic, a different subject that it focuses on. And so sometimes you'll find people are anti-Semitic because they say that Jews are too powerful. Sometimes it's because Jews are poor and are seen as leeches on society. Sometimes Jews have been attacked for being capitalists. Other times they've been attacked for being communists, right? Whatever has been the boogeyman of any society has been lumped onto Jewish people, right? Which is why it's not real, because the hatreds are contradictory in nature. It's really whatever a particular group doesn't like, they identify it with Jewish people, and then it gets lobbed onto them. There recently has been a tour in this area that focuses on the subject of Jewish money and the slave trade. There's a whole discussion about that kind of anti-Semitism in terms of Jewish money as kind of a concept. You don't hear of Christian money or Muslim money. Jewish money is, of course, a a hate in of itself, but the idea that you could take a minority community and blame them for one of the greatest crimes against humanity of the past, centuries, is just a perfect example of this idea of whatever is most hateful to you, the thing that you find as upsetting as possible, blame it on the Jews, right? Kind of blame it on the Jews. So we know that, right? We're familiar with that idea of kind of this oldest hate and the way that it has focuses whatever is considered to be the great evil of any time and place is put onto Jews as being the culprit, right? Being the ones who are responsible for it, right? And so anyone who has any objectivity sees through it, sees how ridiculous it is, understands that it's, scapegoating, right? That there's something else that's really going on. But Jews have become that target, right? So whatever it is that you hate most, you blame it on the Jews. Not as Jewish individuals, but Jews as a group, right? And you kind of essentialize Jewish people in a way where you say it's at the very essence of what it means to be a Jew, to be whatever it is that you feel is wrong or evil in the world. And so that is a difficult position to be in. And as Jewish people, I think it's often difficult for us to understand anti-Semitism because we're on the inside. And so we hear the things that people say, and we know intimately how completely wrong those accusations are. We'll talk a little bit tonight about blood libels, right? But the idea that Jewish people would be drinking the blood of someone, I mean, if you grow up as a Jewish person, the rule is one of the most kind of significant rules is that Jews don't eat blood, right? From animals, right? That if you slaughter a chicken or a cow, all the blood has to be taken out. We salt the meats in order to draw out any blood. I mean, this is a biblical commandment that you shall not consume any blood. And then all of a sudden when you hear people saying, oh, Jews are eating blood, and you're like, where could that even come from? Like, how absolutely ridiculous is it? Don't you know that's one of the kind of core kosher laws of Jews is that we don't consume blood. And so oftentimes the things that Jews are accused of Jewish people have absolutely no relationship to Jews, but say a lot more about the people who are making the accusation than it does than Jews themselves, right? And so the topic that I therefore want to talk about tonight is the way that anti-Semitism has manifested, not across the board, not in every place and every time, but through the lens of the Sephardic experience. And that's because when we talk about anti-Semitism, we often focus on the Crusades, medieval, anti-Semitism, ghettos, the Holocaust, and so forth. But that largely is kind of focusing on Ashkenazi experience. But of course, Ashkenazi Jews in medieval to early modern times were a minority of the Jewish world. The largest of all Jewish communities in the world in medieval times was in Iberia. That was the most significant Jewish community, but of course there were Jewish communities in lots of places around the world, throughout North Africa, the Middle East, and so on. So it's helpful in kind of thinking about this to focus on, for our purposes, on one community as a lens for kind of getting a better understanding of what anti-Semitism is, right? By looking at different experiences, you start kind of to, shall we say, triangulate things and start to identify what it is exactly that we're talking about. And so we're going to have three talks on anti-Semitism through a Sephardic lens. And in some ways, you can think about these three talks as three different manifestations of anti-Semitism: religious, racial, and national. You can also look at it as three different eras as well, what you might think of as kind of medieval, early modern, and kind of modern anti-Semitism. Again, kind of reflecting that idea that Rabbi Sachs said around the mutation of anti-Semitism. But while he largely was drawing on the Ashkenazi kind of experience, we're going to look at the Sephardi experience, where there are differences and parallels at the very same time, and kind of looking at it independently, but also then kind of comparatively is helpful. But because I presume that most people are more familiar with kind of the Ashkenazi experience, it'll be easy for us to kind of focus on the Sephardic experience and then do a bit of kind of compare with what we know of the anti-Semitism that Ashkenazi Jews felt during these different eras, and in slightly different ways. So let's begin with the Jews of Spain. The Jews of Spain in the early medieval period were under the rule of Islam. Yeah. Later, they'll be under the rule of Christendom, right? As the Reconquista picks up steam. But we had a whole talk about this period in history, right? But when Jews kind of follow the establishment of the caliphates in Iberia, and Jewish people are settled there as well, right? So Jewish people are living in Spain, and of course Jews are living under Islam in many places in the Middle East, in North Africa, and also in Spain. Of course, Sephardi itself, literally when we talk about that, we mean Spanish Jewry, Iberian Jewry. Broadly speaking, people often think of Sephardic Jews as anyone who's not Ashkenazi, right? So you'll put in North African and Middle Eastern. There are different reasons for that. One is simply it's very easy to kind of do Ashkenazi and Sephardi. Part of it also is that the influence of Iberian Jews, we know, impacted Jewish people in other places too. Part of that because Jews at different times leave Iberia and go to the land of Israel, go to North Africa, go to the Ottoman Empire, and have influence on those practices. And so many of the religious practices of Jewish people outside of Iberia are influenced by Iberian Jews. And so we kind of generally refer to them as Sephardi Jews, even though, to be more accurate, Sephardi Jews means Spain itself. And so I'm going to kind of try to focus on Spain, but some of the things we talk about, depending on what it is, will have similar things that you would find in other places too. And so when we think about kind of this era, this kind of medieval era of Jews, beginning to live under Islam. Of course, Islam, begins in the 7th century and then expands quite rapidly. And all of a sudden you find Jewish people living under various caliphates in different places. Jewish people obviously find themselves as a minority community in those places. I should say, of course, Jewish people had come from Judea, right? Had come from the land of Israel, but following the persecutions of the Romans, right? Jewish people are forced to kind of live in other regions, and then over the centuries will continue to migrate and seek freedom and opportunity in different places. What we think of Ashkenazi Jews are those who kind of went from the land of Israel to Italy, and then from there up into Central Europe, into places like France and Germany during the medieval times. And the Jews we think of, these Sephardic Jews, are the ones who kind of go from the land of Israel, North Africa, and then kind of over to Iberia, to Spain, and ultimately to Portugal. So the experience of Jews under Islam is quite different in many respects than the experience of Jewish people under Christendom. How so? How so? Well, there's a number of ways in which they are different. In some ways, where you might say the position of Jews under Islam was better. We'll see what we mean by better. In some ways, the position of Jews under Islam is worse. And of course, it will depend from location to location, time to time, condition to condition. But there are some fundamental differences between the experience of Jews under Islam to Jews under Christendom. And it's as follows. There is an inherent religious tension that Christianity has with Judaism, because Christianity is an outgrowth of Judaism and is a rejection of Judaism, but more fundamentally, it is rooted in a belief that God has cast off his covenant with the Jewish people, and the covenant is now with Christians, right? And so in some Christian writings, they'll refer to themselves as the New Israel, right? That is part of the ideology of Christianity during that time. After the Holocaust, Christianity will rethink some of their attitudes towards these things. And so again, these things are not true at all times, all places, and so on, but kind of historically, there was that. And yet, the persistence of Jewish people was seen to, be kind of attention for Christians. Now, part of that was the smear that they made of blaming Jews for the crucifixion of Jesus, right? The person they believed as their God, right? And so there is this kind of hate for Jews of all time because of that. But again, there's this essentialization of Jews that takes place that somehow says, wow, if Jews are responsible for the killing of God, then Jews are the devil. And therefore, they identify Jewish people as devils, right? And so if you look at kind of medieval Christian caricatures of Jewish people, you'll sometimes find them depicting Jews with pointy horns, right? Looking literally like devils, and a whole range of beliefs that kind of emerge during that time that make Jews subhuman, right? They're not regular humans, right? They're subhuman, they're devils. There's something kind of quite, in their mind, different or repugnant, fundamentally repugnant about them. But at its core is obviously this kind of recognition, that Jesus had been Jew, and yet the Jews are not accepting him, right? And so there is this kind of tension of, the longer that Jews, desist from accepting Jesus is kind of like a challenge to Christianity itself. And so there's a lot of kind of tension. Again, we can do a whole course on Christian anti-Semitism, medieval anti-Semitism. That's not my objective for tonight, but simply to kind of paint this figure, this picture of this kind of fundamental inherent tension theologically that Christianity has with Judaism, right? Because their religion believes that Jews were rejected, right? And so that kind of fuels this idea that in a sense, maybe they have a responsibility to demonstrate that Jews have been rejected by not allowing them to live comfortably or to succeed, and so on. And so, again, there's different views within Christian thinking around whether persecution of Jews is or is not acceptable. But the point is that there is this kind of inherent tension that's there. And whenever you have a latent tension, you're going to, at times, have that flare up, right? You can't have tension that sits there without it at times than sparking a fire, right? It's the way that Jewish people in the West have been feeling these past few years, where the response to all these, attacks against Jewish people and Jewish buildings is, well, we're not surprised. We knew this was coming, right? Because you can't have this level of hate bubbling and not at some point have it bubble over. It's what will happen. And so because of this tension that existed between Christianity and Judaism from the perspective of Christians, meant that obviously at times that was going to bubble over. And so you can imagine that the position of Jews in that sense is quite fraught, right? There's a degree of uncertainty and tension that comes with that. The position of Jews in Islam, again, kind of almost on a conceptual level, is far more stable. Jews have a designated status within Islamic law, within Sharia law, right? Jews, this is formulated in the Pact of Umar, which is, whether it's historically correct or not, is kind of understood to be this pact that was made in the 7th century, and that the belief is that it sets in place a series of regulations for how Islam should relate to what's referred to as the people of the book, right? Which relates to Jews, Christians, but primarily to Jews when we use that particular term, and essentially says that while pagans, of course, need to be forcibly converted to Islam, right? If you are a monotheist, right, you are a protected community, right? And in a sense, this belief that there was truth within Judaism, truth within Christianity, yes, they believe there's now a higher truth that Muhammad brought, but there is this kind of protected status of these other monotheistic groups, but they have a designated status as being second class, right? So there are rules that regulate the functions of what they call the dhimmi class, which are let's say Jews, and requires, for example, the Jews have to pay a specific tax, the jizya, right? They have to pay a specific tax. There's regulations on not being able to build or repair synagogues, right? If a Muslim walks by, a Jew needs to stand to the side, right? There's all these kinds of rules. And so in a sense, the situation is worse in that they have a formalized second status that has like very strict rules about it, rules that don't exist in Christian Europe. You don't have there might be things, Jews can't do these businesses or whatever, but you don't have this kind of inherent kind of second class status that's kind of very tightly regulated in the same way. On the other hand, it's predictable. You know where you stand, you know what the rules are, and you can navigate within that framework. Right? And so you don't have then that same experience of you never know when, a king or a bishop is going to try to placate tensions and expel the Jewish community, and kind of this constant ebb and flow, back and forth experience that Jews have during the era of Christian Europe, during medieval times, where they are regularly kind of in a state of uncertainty. So when things are calm, they can do very well, but they never know when that's going to end, and then things can be really bad. Jews under Islam are generally speaking in a more stable position. It's very clear they have a second class status, but they know what their status is. So it's not great, but it's not terrible, right? And it creates, shall we say, where they say good fences create good neighbors, right? It creates at least a bit of a better position in that respect. Now, one of the reasons that things generally work better for Jewish people at that time under Islam is relates to the issue we started with, which is the subject of scapegoating. Now, scapegoating obviously typically focuses on a minority, right, or an individual, right? When you are the only minority, you are in a very precarious position. When you are one of many minorities, your position is a bit more protected because, well, I don't know, lots of people can be blamed, or in a sense, nobody gets blamed. In Christian Europe, their only minority group are Jews. Communities. I mean, you may have individuals here and there, but the only community that you have that's a minority community are Jewish people. In Islam, that's not true, because in Islamic places, you have communities of Jews, you'll have communities of Christians, and then you'll also have, depending on where Islam is spreading, you could have Buddhists or Hindus or Zoroastrians, right? And we know that some of those communities are dealt with in different ways at different times, but the point is Jews don't stand out as other, right? In the same way that Jews stood out as other within Christian Europe, right? And so that creates almost like a bullseye on the experience of Jewish people under Christian rule in Europe. Now, we know that there were times of great success for Jews in Spanish, in Spain under Islam, but we know that Jews were also persecuted in Spain, particularly when there were times of tension, right? As the Reconquista was succeeding, and there was a breakdown within Islamic kind of control, other Muslim rulers came to the fore, particularly the Almohades, come in from North Africa. They conquer Spain, so they're also Muslim rulers, but they persecute the Jewish people. There are probably already forced conversions of Jews then. We know that's, for example, when Rambam's family flees. He's fleeing against the kind of the tyranny of Muslim rulers in Spain in the 12th century. And so it's not like things are always okay, but they are, shall we say, it's happening less frequently than it happening in Christian Spain. But again, you kind of have these, while Christian Spain is kind of maybe like this type of experience, Jews under Islam are kind of down here, but it's a bit more stable, but you still obviously will have times of things are worse or things are better, and so on. And so this era is, of course, defined by religion, right? Religion is kind of the primary identifier of status. And some of these elements, while we're going to kind of talk about different eras, obviously it's not like a tightly packed thing where, this year to this year it's this kind of anti-Semitism, and this year to that year it's a different kind of anti-Semitism, because of course you'll have Jews living under, kind of Pact of Omar status, into the 20th century in some places, right? And religion will be the defining characteristic. But what we're going to find is that the Jews in Spain will experience different kinds of anti-Semitism. It won't be kind of one type that is straight through, but you will also find this mutating anti-Semitism that will emerge as conditions are changing, as one form of anti-Semitism no longer is sticking. Other arguments for hating Jews will emerge. And that really kind of gets to the heart of saying that at the very heart of this is obviously some kind of hatred of Jewish people. However we want to explain what it is, a need for a scapegoat, a need to identify an other, whatever the case is, but what you find is that the constant is the kind of the hatred of Jews, or the persecution, or the kind of antagonism with Jewish people, but the argument for it will change over time or in different places. And so this kind of, what we might think of as comparison, was really kind of put forward by a scholar of Islam, a person by the name of Bernard Lewis. This is just one of his works, Semites and Anti-Semites. This is more of kind of his takeaways of kind of his work as a researcher about Islam and Arab worlds and so on, where he then is kind of looking at things. And he publishes this in the 80s, and the stuff we're kind of experiencing now, I mean, he's writing about it then. I mean, anyone who doesn't have a short memory that only starts from the 7th of October know that all the arguments and criticisms and hates, people have been saying for decades, and that has nothing to do with what happened after the 7th of October. That's just given another kind of way for them to try and argue the same things. So what we're going to be looking at is kind of the way that this evolves, and again, the experience of Sephardic Jews within what essentially is still the same experience, which is being mistreated, being second-class citizens, being persecuted, being put in a difficult position. Ashkenazi Jews do not have the monopoly on anti-Semitic hate. Sephardic Jews sadly have a shared experience too, but again, as I said, it will manifest in different ways. And we'll see at certain times, sometimes Sephardic Jews are actually experiencing certain kinds of hate, even before the Ashkenazi Jews experience those kinds of hates. And that we'll start to see within the next class, when we're going to talk about anti-Semitism as racism, which is an important kind of frame for understanding kind of the way that this hate will mutate as the world moves away from thinking about everything in religious terms. You'll start to see new forms emerging to kind of justify persecutions and kind of hatred of Jewish people. Does anybody have any questions?
Well, the Jews from Spain, I presume that this persecutes more from the Christians rather than the Muslims.
So
that must be because of,
So part of so your question are, Jews in Spain persecuted more by Christians or Muslims? So again, it gets back to this question of their status was clearly second-class status throughout. So they were being persecuted throughout their time, and they were also intensely persecuted during some Islamic periods in Spain. For example, the Almohades, which marks the end of Jewish life under Islam in medieval Spain, because after that, Jews will either leave, like Rambam's family, and end up in North Africa, or they'll flee north into Christian Spain, into Christian-ruled Spain, right? Which the northern part of the country had by then had been reconquered by Christians. So, in a sense, you find, like I said, overall, you kind of think of it as more stability under Islam than under Christendom. But again, that doesn't mean that under Islam there are not times of intense persecution too that they also experience. So that's what I'm saying. It depends exactly the exact time, the exact place, and it's hard to kind of always give kind of off the kind of cuff answers. That's what I'm saying.
After rule of the Muslims, the Christians took over Spain and they really persecuted Jews.
So that's what we'll focus on next. We'll see. There'll be times of, again, it'll start in a sense as a similar way to what you find the experience of Ashkenazi Jews under Christianity. Well, there'll be times of like really good success and times of intense persecution. So that's what we'll kind of look at in the next class, is kind of how that evolves, particularly within the Sephardic Jews, and it'll evolve differently than it does of Ashkenazi Jews under Christians, as it does for Sephardic Jews under Christians in Spain. So that's kind of an important perspective we'll look at.
In the aftermath of the expulsion.
Well, post-expulsion we'll get to. We haven't even touched nearly that point yet. But that's what we'll look at. Yeah.
Welcome with open arms for the not welcomed at all. They were actually killed.
Sorry,
And
when was that?
Yes, Michael.
When was that book?
because they were Jews.
This book over here, Semites and Anti-Semites, this was published in 1987.
Oh, so it's very recent. Okay.
Well,
It does make
1987 is not very recent anymore.
You know, the further you go back, things change.
Yeah, yeah.
So a lot different.
But the table of contents are already quite telling. I mean, his table of contents, he talks about, again, Muslims and Jews, and then he starts the war against anti-Semitism, the war against Jews. So, and what his last chapter is called the new anti-Semitism. This is in the 80s. So what we're seeing now is nothing new. It's just, unfortunately, with a new force. Yeah.
Can I just recap, because I didn't appreciate it, something that you just
Yeah.
said, or I didn't have to know, that the Jewish presence in Muslim Spain ended in the 12th century.
Yes. Yes.
I don't say that.
Yeah. So it kind of exists from the 9th century to the 12th century. So it's, you know,
Converted the Jews.
that's Andalusia, right? Andalusia, that's what we think of when we think of Andalusia.
There's no Jews in Andalus, is it?
Yes. Now, obviously, Toledo will already be recaptured by Christians by then. So there'll be Jews in Toledo. Yeah? But it's not Andalusia anymore in the sense of that kind of old, what historians refer to as the convivencia. You know, this time period in Muslim Spain where Jews, Christians, and Muslims, lived together peacefully and shared philosophical knowledge with each other and a love of science and poetry, right? This kind of very beautiful kind of way of thinking about this harmony that existed there. But again, there was very clear hierarchy that existed.
Because you've got beautiful synagogues in Cordova, Toledo, and they were successful, wealthy Jews. Like, they built beautiful synagogues. So there must have been harmony. But you said it's secular. So when you first started out,
Yeah.
you said every 75 years, which is interesting. You actually gave a number to it, but it happens, the cycle is every 75 years. I don't know.
I think as we kind of go through these talks, I'll be able to show that more clearly, certainly over the past 300 years, where you kind of can really see this this pattern playing itself out. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
You've made the distinction between, say, Christian Europe and Islamic Spain, but before Islam started moving out from the Saudi Peninsula, a lot of the Middle East was in fact Christian, wasn't it? Where you have the Maronites, and various other forms of Eastern Christianity.
Yeah.
And there were Jewish communities there already. So was it an easier relationship, let's call it Orthodox Christianity rather than Western?
So already starting from the 4th century, the Council of Nicaea, you start to have kind of formulations about it. Obviously, originally, Christians were persecuted by the Romans. And then under Constantine, right, he adopts Christianity as the religion of the Roman Empire. And then, obviously as Rome falls, it just becomes kind of the dominant, continues to be the dominant religion. And you start to have already being formulated kind of ideas about the relationship to Jewish people. The idea that Jewish people are a witness, right? Their degradation is a witness to the fact that they have been abandoned. And so maybe start at kind of this formulation of this idea that we need to keep Jews low so that they can demonstrate that they have been rejected. But at the same time, there may be rules that say, but you obviously can't harm them, because if you don't have Jews, then they can't be a witness to the fact that they have been rejected. So it's something which is kind of starting to take form and to take shape. It will get really bad once you get to the Crusades. So once you get to the 11th century, right, that's when things are really going to start to get quite, difficult. But it's not the first time Jews are persecuted. We know that when the Visigoths end up in the Iberian Peninsula, before Muslim rulers get there, there is a forced conversion of Jews to Christianity then, which is like in the 7th century. And so there definitely are tensions that will exist between Jews and Christians even before that time, but it'll get particularly nasty once you get into the 11th century, right?
Yeah, I suppose what I was trying to get at is that in Western Christianity, you've gone through that. I wondered if it was a slightly different experience in sort of Eastern Christianity.
So again, the thing you'll find in Eastern Christianity is, again, the idea that there's multiple minority groups, yeah? And again, wherever you have lots of minority groups, that's usually a better position for Jews to be in, not always. And so you don't have those same kind of stories. But again, early on already, Muslims will take control of those places, right? So 8th century, Islam is, you already have the beginning of, the various caliphates ruling the Middle East, spreading up eventually, into the areas of Turkey and so on. So, already quite early on, it's already going to be, it will no longer be Christian, the rule. There'll be Christians in those places, but they won't necessarily be the ones who are ruling anymore. And you don't have Jews in places like Russia until later, right? So kind of when you think of other Orthodox Christian communities, in some of those places, that's not where Jews are at that point.
Did the Jews come from the destruction of the second Basilica to Spain when that was destroyed?
So at the times of the destruction, you have Jewish people who will start to appear in different places around the Mediterranean because the Romans rule these places. So there is evidence of Jewish existence. Some of them were slaves, or they would have gone there for trade, right? Different reasons. Obviously, Italy is well known, but in all these places, you'll find some evidence of Jews, but you don't really have the larger numbers until, kind of several centuries later, until it kind of slowly starts to build up. Usually, as there's kind of migration patterns, then you'll find the Jews will kind of go, but as often in places, you'll have a few Jews that go first, and then more that come later, right? And so it will evolve. The large numbers in Iberia will be under Islam, but as I said, there's evidence of forced conversions pre-Islam. So there obviously were already Jewish communities there in the 5th, 6th, 7th century already. Yeah.
In southern Italy, they found
Yeah.
Western synagogues that predate the destruction of the temple. They were not oriented to Jerusalem.
Yes.
Were there free Jews in Iberia around?
Were there any areas of Iberia where the Jews were not a minority group?
As far as we knew, Jews were always a minority. I mean, I don't know if they're, I assume you're thinking, was there particular cities where they were made up the majority of the population or whatever?
The majority were safe from persecution because numerically they were larger than other groups.
Yeah, I'm not sure.
I mean, your thesis...
Statistics from medieval times are very difficult.
Oh, I'm sure.
Are very difficult. People don't even, listen, you wouldn't talk about the expulsion. You have some people say, hundreds of thousands of Jews were expelled from Spain, and other people who say it was tens of thousands. It gives you a sense of the wide range. We don't really know population numbers.
Because if the thesis of racism is it's dangerous being a minority group, the obvious question is, was there a point in time where Jews in any location were not a minority group?
That I don't know. But it's not about being the minority, it's about being the only minority.
Yes, no, I understand.
That's kind of where you kind of have the, but again, it's not about being the only minority, it is also about the inherent tension that Christianity has with Judaism historically, which was different than kind of Islam inherently, its relationship to Judaism, which is a bit different. So there's a number of different factors, that are going on there. Okay. All right, thank you everyone.